Hello and welcome to IABSE in Conversation, where I, David Knight, talk to eminent and interesting people in the structural engineering community about what inspires them and their life and career. Today I'm delighted to welcome the journalist and writer Helena Russell as my guest. For many years, Helena was the editor of Bridge Design and Engineering and was a fixture at regular international conferences and events that IABSE puts on. However, I want to start by heading back to the beginning of your career, Helena. You started as an engineer. Where did all this start? Was there a particular experience or influence that pushed you into engineering in your childhood?
Yes, there was actually. I was always interested in science, although more in physics. I wasn't particularly bothered about chemistry or biology. So I was very interested in physics and maths and so on. And when I was at school, I was given the opportunity to go on a week's Women into Engineering. It was the Women in Science and Engineering organisation who did, they organised trips for students, probably at A-level, I think it was, to find out about careers in engineering. And involved going to Manchester, and we visited the university, we saw some, the labs there, we went to Jodrell Bank. We did a lot of things, finding out about different types of engineering. We didn't actually do anything to do with structural engineering or civil engineering, but I realised that I wanted to do something like that, that was practical, that would deliver something tangible, that had a purpose to it. So I came back, I found out more about civil engineering, realised that that would be also my it would work with my interest in being outdoors and having an influence on the landscape and so on. So I decided to apply for a civil engineering degree. So that was really how that happened. And the funny thing, the thing that always makes me laugh is that my father, who was a maths teacher, who was very supportive of his daughters going into science and engineering and so on, he had a very negative view of civil engineering, which I was quite surprised by. And it turned out that when he first left college, he did a stint in the drawing office, doing drawings, and found it very boring, and told me that that's what I would be doing, that I wouldn't enjoy it.
Yeah, it is funny. The influence our parents have on us is it sometimes pushes us in one direction, sometimes pushes us in completely the opposite direction, depending on what they say and why they say it, isn't? But you're obviously a very numerate background then, if your father was a maths teacher.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then onto university, and your first job was after university was with the contractor John Lang in the early 90s. What was it like on site in the early 90s?
It was interesting. I have to say that when I was recruited by John Lang's, it was a time when there was and also the same when I went to university, there was a big push to have more representation for women in the industry. So I did benefit from that initiative in that you didn't have to battle quite so hard to be taken seriously. You know, there was positive discrimination going on. So they were very keen, especially having more women on site and more women involved in contracting, because that still, I think, is still very low. It's getting a lot better now, but
do you think that is changing? You talk about a push in the early 90s. I know we've had recent or it's become very obvious recently how bad some parts of the sector are. Are we generally going in the right direction, or do you think we sort of go in peaks and troughs about representation?
Well, I think when I'm comparing it to when I first went to site, yes, definitely there's improvements. And I mean, a lot of those are not necessarily to do with getting more women on site. They're to do with improving the quality of life and the safety and so on for everybody on site. There were things that I found that I had to implement which hadn't even been thought about. For example, on the main head office for the site had nice big porta cabins and proper facilities and so on, but then there were the outlying project sites which looked after, because it was a road project, it had several little sort of satellite offices, and I was based in one of those, and that was literally a couple of porta cabins and one toilet, and the toilet was used by everybody. operatives, engineers, and I've just had to put my foot down and say, we need another toilet, at least one more, you know, because I'm sorry, I'm not using that one. So things like that, you know, which today would not be, you know, you wouldn't even have to ask for that. And the conditions, you know, the sort of, I suppose the office conditions were poor, that was quite cold.
Was there still a lot of resistance on site? It's quite and it still is quite a traditional industry in many ways, unfortunately, to having a woman in an engineering role, or did you feel that you were accepted? And
I think the key to that was that I had already spent 3 years at university in a male-dominated environment. So I was already quite, I think you've got to have a certain level of self-confidence and be, you know, I suppose feel confident about your own abilities. The things that I found the most difficult were actually the working with the operatives was fine, because you could just have a laugh with them and you know, take things with a bit of a pinch of salt, have a sense of humour, but be firm, and you know, they grow to respect you. But I did sometimes find that some of the other engineers, people, you know, with educated backgrounds, were not, you know, found it very difficult to relate to me.
Yeah. So. Well, I'm hopeful that things have improved. I know we've still got a long way to go. I'm conscious that this is but one part of your career, so I'm sorry to dwell on it at the beginning, but it is fascinating to look at how things have changed over time in a career, and I'm hopeful we're making steps in the right direction with all of this.
One of the things that I've recently been asked by, I'm working with Historic England, because they've been looking after the archive for John Lang. They've been given all these sort of photographs. I don't know if you've seen any of the coverage of that, but they've basically taken on all the photographs of projects and so on, and they've been working with former employees to go into schools and talk to children about engineering and what Lang did, and use the archive as a way of getting them interested. And so it's been quite interesting going back, and I've been doing some filming and so on with them, talking about so I've been thinking about all these things a lot. And one of the things that Lang's did when I joined was they sent all their graduates on away for a couple of weeks to Bircham Newton to do a training course where you learned how to, well, you had an experience of how to fix steel, how to dig, excavate safely, how to go up a tower crane and things like that. And you know, I'm not sure if other contractors do that, but I always thought it was really useful, because you then went on site and you had a little bit of understanding of what the difficulties were that the people you were telling what to do had to achieve.
It sounds fascinating, but within a couple of years, you'd gone on to take a job as a reporter for New Civil Engineer. Writing's obviously a passion of yours alongside engineering. It's somewhat unusual to find that in most engineers. How had you nurtured that passion, and what made you take the change at that point and go and work for New Civil Engineer?
I think a couple of things. I've always written. I've always written in my personal capacity, and I'm very lucky that I found it comes naturally, which I know it doesn't to a lot of engineers. I also, when I was at school, my A-levels weren't just sciences. I also did French as well, so I had kept up that need to write and express yourself and so on. But I think the move was really prompted by, I enjoyed being an engineer, but I realised that I don't think it was really the nuts and bolts of it weren't really my passion. The calculations, the sort of the whole engineering side, I suppose. I was okay at it, but it wasn't something that I did with a great relish. And I also found the sort of lifestyle was quite, I suppose it was difficult to settle down, because if you're working for a contractor, you're moving around a lot. So that didn't really attract me as a long-term thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw a job advertised at New Civil Engineer, and I remember looking at it and thinking, oh, it's my job. And I hadn't even really thought about it. I was looking through the job pages of New Civil Engineer, as you do. That was in the days when they had, pages and pages of them. But it was so strange that I never really doubted that I would get it. And it sounds really quite arrogant, but it's weird.
It seems to fit perfectly with, and obviously through the rest of your career with that technical edge, but a writing and communication passion, doesn't it?
That's
and
right. Yeah.
What was it like at New Civil Engineer? Were you in a large office and nipping out on to go and see projects from time to time, or was it?
Yeah, it was a very interesting time. It was strange for me in the first place being in an office because we wasn't used to that. I hadn't been doing so much of that. It was a very lively place, and at the time, the editor at the time was Ty Bird, who is still, I don't know if he's still in the industry. I still have contact with him from time to time, but he was a very very lively, larger than life kind of figure that you admired. You wanted his admiration, but you also feared him, which is probably what most editors are like. I hope I wasn't like that when I was an editor, but I didn't have many staff. So. But I had it was a sort of process where you were learning how to communicate news. News was a really big thing in those days, and still is in the weekly press, because you're always being competitive with your people like Construction News. There was the Contract Journal at the time, so there were a lot of weekly magazines that you had to try and get the news stories and exclusives and so on. And I think 2 weeks after I joined, with very little experience as a reporter, I was sent up to Huddersfield, where there was a sewage works where a great big pile of sludge had there was a failure, basically a slope failure on a storage area, and I think it had gone into the river or something. I can't remember exactly, but I was told, go up there, get that story, don't come back until you've got the story. And I was absolutely backing myself.
It has overtones of all of the books about the tabloid newspapers that you read,
Yeah.
and being a cub reporter and sent out.
It's Drop the Dead Donkey,
Yeah.
I mean, that was on at the time. I think it was around about that time, and we always used to watch that and think, oh yeah. So I was sitting on this train going up to Huddersfield thinking, I really have got no idea what I'm doing. I got the story.
Well, yeah. Well, I was going to say, hopefully you had enough to come back with a good story and something that.
Yeah. So I had lead story. 2
yeah.
weeks. 2 weeks after joining. So,
Fantastic.
and that was, I think, the process that everybody went through there. So it was lively. It was fun.
So you had 6 years or so at New Civil Engineer, and then you moved to become editor at British Design Engineering. I think it was a relatively new magazine at that point, but correct me if I'm wrong.
It was, yes, yeah.
What was it like taking the magazine from that to it's now almost a fixture on the international stage in terms of the British community? That must have been quite a big process of growth and positioning, really.
It was. It was a very interesting role to take on. I was actually headhunted when they launched the magazine, but not for that magazine. I was headhunted for the other magazine that the company published, which was World Highways. And I went to be interviewed, and I decided it wasn't really my cup of tea. Highways, there's a limit to what I could get interested in on highways. So what happened then was they recruited somebody to take on that. They appointed somebody for that role, and the editor who'd launched British Design Engineering moved on to take British Design Engineering on full time. And then when he left, they called me and said, we offered you this job and you didn't want it. We've got another one now. And I was like, oh yes, that's definitely more my cup of tea. So.
And what is it about bridges then? Obviously, if it's not highways, but you're keen on bridges.
Oh, come on!
You've got to tell me. I know why I think bridges are the bee's knees, but that's different.
Well, a road
different
is a
for different
road.
people. Okay.
A road is a road, and it's a road is a road wherever it is. It can be beautiful, but only in the right setting. I think a bridge, has so much more opportunity for. Making something stunning. I mean, it also obviously has an opportunity for making things that are not so stunning, but it conveys so much more about the, I suppose, about the designer, about the way it's, about engineering in whole, really. Most people wouldn't think that roads are engineering, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in that. And there was a fantastic conference, which I didn't go to, but in Berlin, the previous footbridge conference, which really focused on the concept of storytelling and the aspect of storytelling in the work that we do and how we add to the world around us. How does that fit into what you're talking about? Is there a sense of story in bridges, and is that something that you try and bring out?
Yeah, that's funny because I quite often, if I'm working with people who are writing articles or were writing articles for me at BD&E, they would say, well, what do you want me to put in here? Can you send me a list of questions? And I would, send a list of questions. And I think sometimes they were expecting me to say, well, how much concrete is there in here? And how many tons of rebar and so on? I'd say, well, what things did you look at, and what did you choose, and why did you make that decision? What were the things that influenced you, and so on? And usually I would sort of sign off at the end saying, the most important thing is you need to tell the story of how you got from the start to what you've got now, so that people are interested. So it is all about storytelling. Certainly the communication of a project. It's about making people interested. Nobody, unless there's somebody who compiles statistics, is interested really in. If you've used a lot less concrete than you might have done, that's interesting. But if you've just used so many cubic meters, it's not.
Yeah. So it's about creating interest then for you. It's a sort of a hook to take the story.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Into
I mean, there's no
readership.
point publishing an article if no one's going to read it. So that's why it's so important. Your first paragraph and your intro is so important. You can't have an intro that says in 1992, blah blah blah. Somebody's going to go, I don't need to know this. This is 30 years ago.
Yeah. And do you think there's obviously a synergy between what you're talking about of writing, publishing, communicating about a design, and then the actual engineering itself and the work that's done? Do you think there's a communication aspect, but do you think there's other values that really good writing brings to engineering and design? Does it help other parts of the process?
I think it does, and I think there's certainly when you're talking about the footbridge conference, for example, I think the development of that footbridge sector over the last 20 or 30 years has been very interesting because of the influence of other designers, architects, artists, and so on. Bringing them into the process has enabled, I think, or it's maybe prompted people to think more about what influence these bridges have on the landscape, on the people that use them. It's all about being that sort of scale of person scale. So somebody walking across the footbridge is going to touch it, they're going to look at it, they're going to linger, they're not just driving across quickly, getting from A to B. So I think that has really changed the way that, I hope it's really changed the way that engineers think about what their sort of aims are, try to be more mindful about the outcomes from that point of view. And I think also it has changed a lot with a lot more community engagement. So it's a lot more common these days for projects and clients to get the community involved in some way or another. And obviously when you're communicating to people who don't understand engineering to the same degree, it's important that you can do that in a way that they understand. And I'm not talking about double-decker buses and football pitches. You know, they have a place, but I always get really annoyed. Is that the only way that you can communicate?
Size
it comes
and
back to the rebar.
Yes, yeah. What does that mean? And it's really interesting because I've been doing some architectural teaching recently on a technical level, but it's fascinating to see how much more architects are taught and engage in the written word and writing about their projects compared to engineers. I know I did maybe one essay in 4 years at university. Yeah. And do you think it would be a valuable skill for more engineers to be able to write well about what they do?
Absolutely. And we had, when I was at university, there was a module on our course which was called, I don't know, it was communication or something. We did a whole year's module on that, which was very unusual at the time, I think. We also, as well as doing written work, we also did some broadcasting. So we did recordings. That was hilarious. I can remember doing that. I had this jumper that I'd knitted myself, and it was quite big. And when I was being recorded, I was wearing this jumper, and the whole thing I remember afterwards was I kept pushing the sleeves on it. The sleeves kept falling down, and I kept pushing these sleeves back. Nobody was listening to what I was saying. They were just looking at me and with these. But it did teach me a lesson, you know, about presentation and so on. But yes, I mean, I don't know if that's something that's taught these days, or whether there's so much focus on the actual academic and the sort of engineering aspects. But I certainly think it needs to be.
But it's all about communication, isn't it? As engineers, we are probably focused on communication with our immediate colleagues, the people who sit either side in project terms. And I think sometimes we forget about communication beyond that, beyond our local or our industry strata and into the public or other people who are affected by the structure. And it's sometimes, to me, I think we need to promote that. Even just the practice of writing well would help people crystallise what they're doing beyond just the communication staging side of it.
I think also the the wider use of social media is helpful in some ways for that. It's also probably a hindrance, but I think it prompts people to think more about how they're presenting themselves, how they're presenting their projects. And I would like to see more people talking about what they're doing. I know that there's always that slight reluctance because you're worried about what your client's thinking, or are you allowed to talk about things, or so on. But I really think it's important because, especially on things like Twitter and LinkedIn, you never know who's going to be reading that. And that's a really powerful educational tool, I think, that your enthusiasm about something could be transferred to somebody in another sector, in another generation. It could inspire somebody. Some of the social media accounts that I follow do a really, really good job of promoting what they're doing to a wider audience, and I think we really need a lot more of that.
And well, you spent was it almost 20 years at BD&E? You must have visited and written about an extraordinary number of bridges in that time. Is it fair to ask if you've got a favourite, if you've got a particular project that you think, yes, that's the one I really enjoyed?
I visited, yeah. There's a lot that I really enjoyed, and I've been really privileged to be able to go to places like Japan, South Korea, Russia, and most of Europe I've visited, and the States, and even Brazil, actually. I think one of my favourite site visits, certainly the most recent ones, was to go to the third Bosphorus Bridge when it was under construction. I went and had a full site tour of the project, and it was I think they were just starting to lift the deck units up, and that was amazing because it was in a really beautiful location. It was a very interesting bridge because it had this combined cable suspension cable stay kind of setup. It was being built quite rapidly. There was a lot going on, and it was fascinating. So I was really lucky to go with Jean-Francois Klein as well, who was one of the designers on it. So that was a really interesting, fascinating trip. And I've also, I think some of the other ones that I've really enjoyed have been the ones where I've seen renovations and strengthening works on big bridges. So things like the Lions Gate Bridge, which was the first project where they took the deck off and put a new bit on overnight, and did that on a sort of nighttime closure process. That was fascinating as well. But there's been so many, and that's talking about the big bridges, because they're obviously they have a huge impression on you when you see the scale of what's being done, and you think about the amount of work and engineering that goes into that, and
the sheer number of people involved. It's one of the things I've always loved is that 5,000 people can point at that and go, that was me, I did that, and actually we're all working in a team to make it happen. And the shift from being a reporter to BD&E, where your style is a bit different, is quite interesting. And did you feel that you could still criticise at BD&E? Was it a critical look at what was going on, or was it a reportage look and say and tell a story kind of approach? Is there a balance to be struck in how you work between the two?
Yeah, I think it's quite different. Excuse me. On a magazine like that, where you're in quite a small sector, and you have a duty to try to be have integrity and have editorial independence from the people that you're writing about. But you're also obviously talking to a small sector where a lot of these people you're meeting them on a day-to-day basis, or you're in contact with them, and it's a community. So I think the difference is that you have to try and avoid the sensational, kind of the weekly newspapers and weekly magazines that I used to work on. It will very much go in, do it, file the story, move on to the next one. And you'd be dealing with people that on a story, and then you might not speak to them again for ever, maybe even a few years. So they weren't people that you relied on as contacts and, as you saw as, I suppose, colleagues in a way. So I think it's certainly, you need to be more mindful. There's also the difference that you don't need to have that. You're not being competitive in having to break stories. We quite often would cover, if there were technical issues, we might cover them as a piece, when they were resolved. We would write about what went wrong so that the readers could actually learn from that, rather than having a big story going, this thing fell down, here's some people who think they know what happened, but they don't actually know. And then you never get to hear the final report, which would tell you what actually happened. So I think we tried to do more of that sort of thing, where we would say, we might report that this had happened, and fatalities or not, or what the outcome was, but we would then go back and do a detailed look at the report, if there was one, obviously.
Which would be
that's not always the case. But
which would be much more useful for your audience. And it is a very different approach, it strikes me, to architectural criticism, which is it can be kind of one-upmanship sometimes, but it is also a sort of specialism in its own right, and it is a sort of accepted part of architectural discourse, whereas it's not something that we sort of are comfortable with in engineering terms. We very rarely
Yeah, the
get a
whole sort of
critical look
critics.
at at exactly, well, this is someone else's view of what could have happened or should have worked or didn't work, and that kind of thing. Do you think there is space for that criticism?
Well, absolutely, yeah, I think so. And I think it's really healthy when you get architects and engineers to talk each other's work as well. So you know, so that architects, I think, especially if they're not working in the bridge industry, they come up with these ideas and they've never really been exposed to the reality of whether that would work or not. Or whether there's a, you know, more realistic way to do it, or and you know, you can have as many kind of nice renderings as you like, but if you can't build that, it's meaningless. And I think that's one of the downsides of the way that architects work from my point of view, is that quite often things get sketched up and they never reach construction for whatever reason, whether that's just because it was a, you know, someone's idea that they never intended, whether it was a competition win that never got built, but so they never get exposed to that. And I think when you've got engineers and architects looking at each other's work and going, well, you know, architects going, well, you can't make it look a bit better, or do you not think that this doesn't, you know, clashes with that? And you've got engineers looking at architects and going, well,
yeah. And I think, going back to your point about the footbridge industry over the past 20 years, that's really where we've got much better at those conversations, and the best relationships are mutually constructive when it comes to bridge design. And the only point I'm making, I suppose, is that happens internally within project teams and privately, but there isn't, apart from in social media and blog posts, there isn't necessarily a place where that criticism, or the written criticism, is made public, because I think sometimes those views are as valid and perhaps as important to communicate more widely.
And also within project teams, there's always a dynamic. There's always politics. If you're, you know, if you're having crit with people who don't have any, you know, agenda, then there's maybe scope for a bit more open debate, rather than somebody going, well, this is the client, this is what they want to see, and you're going, oh no, how can I tell them that that's not really, you know?
Yeah. So we got to know each other when I was designing a new swing bridge at the mouth of Deptford Creek. You were a local resident at that point, but obviously a resident with lots of specialist knowledge. You're the chair of the Deptford Society and have written a lot about the local area. What draws you to both Deptford, but also to sort of the hyper-localism and concentration on your community?
I think, I have to say, I think that's more to do with, it's very much to do with actually living in Deptford, because I've lived in quite a few different parts of southeast London, and I've never lived anywhere that has a community quite like Deptford. It's a very long-standing community, and it's a very close-knit sort of area. You have a big shopping street with a big market, and you can't go shopping without meeting somebody. It's a bit like living in a village with all the sort of, you know, pros and cons that entails. And I think the sort of, I suppose the heritage of the area, it's got a lot of history. So all those things play into it. I'm very interested in heritage. I mean, the Deptford Society, one of the main aims for the Deptford Society is to retain the conservation area. You know, when I first moved here, I would have been amazed to think that Deptford High Street was a conservation area, and it is, and it's, unfortunately, it's under threat. But I think that you know, we've got quite a good, strong group of people living here now who are taking an interest and responding to planning applications and so on, and there are actually quite a lot of people who live on the high street who've been there for 30 or 40 years, which I find amazing as well, because you don't think living over a shop is a long-term, and most people don't aspire to that as a long-term you know, aim, but it's I think it's just the Deptford sort of thing.
It was quite formative for me in that process. So this is what became known as the Greenwich Reach Swing Bridge, which I know is a sore point. But I, being relatively young engineer and relatively new on Twitter and sharing what was going on and getting engagement from local residents, it was a fascinating process. I was very naive about it, but it made me wonder more about how engineers engage with those local communities, because while Deptford to our office at that stage was not very far, often you're building bridges many thousands of miles away, or too far to visit more than once or twice in construction. And do you feel like there is, a difficult question to answer, how do engineers get more involved in those community discussions and engagement?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I mean, it's possible that will change now, because we're all more used to doing these kind of, even the general public are more used to doing this kind of video meeting type of thing. But I think it's always difficult, and that was always going to be a difficult one, because although it's very close to Deptford, which has a very close-knit community. It's in Greenwich Borough, which is renowned for being quite. They're interested in Greenwich, the Royal Heritage area. They're interested in certain parts, but they're not really interested in that bit of Greenwich. And I think they probably didn't do a great job of promoting or trying to get people involved, because they just don't have the connections. So I think. It's definitely a case of trying to get out there on social media. That's not the be all and end all, I have to say, because I think we've always got to remember there's a lot of people out there in digital poverty, especially in these sort of areas. So you're not going to get everybody that way, and not everybody who's got a computer is interested in social media. But I think it's a really useful way of adding to what the consultation process that already goes on. So more visibility, more people getting to hear about it, I think.
It's something I think for lots of engineers to think about in their practice. And you've recently moved on from BD&E. I assume we're going to continue to be hearing a lot more from you. So what's next? What are you up to now? Where are you going?
Well, I've been, I think it was, how long ago now? It's about 18 months since I left BD&E, and I had a break of a few months when I just did not very much, although I did still do some writing for BD&E actually, and I'm still doing that now. But my main interest is to do some different things. So I've been doing writing for Building magazine, for the Construction Index, for Construction News. And that's been really interesting, because I've been doing totally different things. I've been doing buildings, and I've had to learn new sort of terms that I've totally forgotten about. Things like, what's the building envelope, and all these things about thermal transfer and things that never came into bridge engineering. So it's been really interesting, actually, and also looking at the different way that teams work on buildings. I've also been reporting on Tideway Tunnel, so I've done a lot of different things, which is I find it a lot more stimulating. And also, obviously, I've got my own working for myself. I have my bit more freedom. I'm also doing some marketing and communications work for an organisation called the Get It Right Initiative, which is a group of companies in the industry who are trying to reduce the occurrence of error in construction. And it's a very interesting, I suppose the interesting proposition is that it's about getting it right. It's not about necessarily using software to do this, or it's just about learning from what's happened before and not doing it again. Which, as we know, the people have been trying to do for a long time. But having a sort of more of a networking and I suppose knowledge transfer organisation with specialist training and so on is helpful for that. So.
It seems like, from the outside, a very valuable organisation, and obviously something that's yeah, we're keen to engage with more, and it'd be great to hear more as it progresses. And that sort of feels like a good place to leave it. Helena, thank you for being our guest and a fascinating conversation. If you'd like to know more about Helena, please head to her website, www.helenarussell.com. This is a podcast from the British group of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Engineers. IABSE is a group of designers and engineers that are passionate and inspired by the world around us. To find out more, head to our website at www.iabse.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening.